I'm Gordon Lohr. I am a volunteer who worked on Pine Slash when Andy Shield asked me to help restore the property. It was in a relatively fragile condition. It had been neglected for many years. Termites and powder post beetle had taken their toll. Groundhogs had dug under the foundations, and literally it was about to fall into the basement. So I went out to look at it and decided that it probably would be a really good thing if I volunteered and tried to save the house because of its age and its location. It was convenient to get to because I always felt like it was what it had been purported to be, the honeymoon cottage for Patrick Henry and his wife when their main house burned. Such an early house, I had plenty of hand tools and the skills to do a lot of the work. And he did cooperate with me and help me as much as he could. Over several years, with Andy's help, we got the basement secured, and I began working on the structure of the house. We had input from the Department of Historic Resources because of their easements on the property to protect it. And so during this process, we had to basically maintain those easements and not do anything that would dramatically alter the house itself. I worked on it for several years and learned as I went. It was a good opportunity to work on a house of this age. During this process, I had Ed Chappell and Carl Lounsbury from Colonial Williamsburg bring field schools out and make drawings and study the building. It's a relatively unique form of architecture. Only a couple of these buildings have survived that are 18th century. One in Maryland, which has been significantly altered, and then this one. These are built of conventional vertical posts with down braces into the frame, but the walls themselves are massive, 2-inch thick yellow pine planks mortised into the sills and into the wall plate above, and they also act as a paneling on the inside. So these are part of the framing of the house, which they call vertical plank houses. And they also had siding nailed to their exterior, which gave you a pretty secure house. But it's a simple form of construction, and when you think about it being a store, you think about these massive planks and the massive L-shaped or guttered corner posts that hold this building together. It would be hard to sneak into like a smokehouse and take out what was in the store. And you always wonder why a house of this age, which was basically in the age of oak construction, would they use pine timbers, which is susceptible to insect damage. But in thinking about the name of the property, Pine Slash, it's basically an old area of basically rough pine trees, which may or may not have been cut over, but a swampy area, and the area behind it fit the criteria perfectly. And there's almost no oak in this house except for the lintel over the kitchen fireplace. So everything is constructed of local sawn pine, some species, Pinus taida or rigida, one of the swamp pines. And then the kitchen wing, everyone assumed was built in the 1820s. It has cut nails and some timbers that date from that time. In doing archaeology under the floor of this kitchen wing, I found tons of charcoal blocks and bits and pieces that seemed to indicate there was another building right on that site that probably caught fire and this building, this kitchen wing from 1820 has probably been rebuilt at that time. At least that's my explanation. You have one massive chimney there, and when you look at the firebox in that kitchen wing, it is English bond, which is an earlier form of construction, and it's such a massive chimney with that huge lintel. It would indicate that it was earlier and probably did catch fire and fell, and then was rebuilt at that time. The building retains a lot of its original construction material, which is good. In the long walls, you can find that a lot of the timbers had been eaten out, at least one 10-foot section, and was just hastily propped up. At that point, I got other heart pine planks and hand planed them and mortised them in place like the originals had been done, planed off an area and wrote on it the date on each timber when it was put back in, so it won't fool anyone. And on the inside of these plank walls, when they were just exposed rough into the room, although they were hand planed, and they put rails and stiles over them, which were molded or beaded, depending on which room you're looking at. And these gave the appearance of sunken paneling, which was a really interesting thing, and gives the house its interior flair or character, which appeals to most anyone. I've done tours for Colonial Williamsburg here and lots of other people who are very fascinated by the architecture and the appearance of this building. All the exterior doors and some of the interior doors are just plain battened, beaded boards, and what you would expect for this type of building. We had a lot of controversy about the date of this house, and a number of architectural historians thought it dated in the 1780s or as late as 1800, which I never thought. When you look at the types of construction that are in there, the nails and other materials, I always thought that it was early. So at some point, we did dendrochronology. The Oxford Laboratory did dendrochronology on the timbers in the house, which involves finding an area on a timber that has bark on the edge of it that when they were cut out of the tree, you could take that bark edge and bore back toward the center of the log, getting a reading perpendicular to the tree rings. And that gives you a pretty accurate date because there has been dendrochronology done on standing trees all over the U.S. now, and these are all in a laboratory as a record of these, and they can be accessed. It's better if you can get borings from trees that are still alive and you extrapolate backward. The tree rings in a wet year will be wider than the tree rings in a dry year. And so you can make comparative studies which are quite accurate. In doing this, they determined that the felling date for these trees was in the spring of 1749 and the winter of 1749-50, based on where these timbers were in the house. So the presumption is that this house was probably built between 1750 and 51, which would be pretty accurate and certainly confer with my opinion. But we've done lots of studies of this building with Colonial Williamsburg and UVA's architectural school. So everyone seems to concur now that the date is around 1750-51, which would fall within the parameters of Patrick Henry using this property. And we know that Patrick Henry and his brother had a plantation store, and this may well have been it. But, you know, as a temporary structure to live in until you got a better house, you do have heat and you've got shelter. And there were other buildings around here. We found the foundations of a smokehouse and dairy and a privy all around there. None of them have been dug, but we were able to find the outlines of them in the soil, which is pretty indicative. You could have used it as a residence. I think it was a plantation store early on. Most large plantations, wealthy people, had plantation stores. It was a good place to sell necessities to the neighbor. I know we found one at Brooks Bank Plantation down on the Rappahannock that had been put up by a Scottish merchant in the 1740s. And it was a pretty substantial structure, much like this.